Thank you, Mike.
Yep.
I have my mic on. You hear it all right? So you may have been wondering what the heck I was doing in Ukraine. It wasn't exactly on people's bucket list as places to go and visit. So I'll give you a little background on my life. I'm a retired attorney, and I was with the federal government for 35 years. 27 of those, I think, I was with the Federal Trade Commission. And if you don't know anything about the FTC, it's kind of been in the news lately about this Google thing and all that. But the FTC has two responsibilities. One is antitrust, or competition as we called it, and the other is consumer protection. I was fortunate enough to be in a regional office. I was first in our regional office in Denver, and that office was closed in 1999. And then I moved to San Francisco, transferred there, and was in the San Francisco regional office. So if you work in Washington, D.C. for the FTC, you do either competition or you do consumer protection. You don't do both. But in regional offices, you can do both. Most people do. So I had those two backgrounds. And as part of our work, once the Soviet Union collapsed, we started sending advisors over to former Soviet Union countries. So I was sent to Latvia and Lithuania both in 95 and 96 to help them, because they're trying to set up their laws, their competition laws, their consumer protection laws. They don't know anything about that, because they did not have a market economy. So I was fortunate enough to do that. And we expanded our program at some point to include other countries like India, Indonesia. I went to Peru also. I was in Peru in 2008 for 6 months, advising people on antitrust and consumer protection issues. So then I retired in the beginning of 2012. And in, gotta think now, 2018, I was asked if I would come out of retirement and go to Ukraine because they needed help. By this time, we no longer had advisors in Poland. We didn't have any in Hungary, a number of those other countries, but Ukraine still needed a lot of help. And I'll kind of go into some of that, why that was. So I had to think about that for a while. Do I really want to go over there? I didn't know much about Ukraine. And so I had kind of a learning curve. I had to read some books and figure it out. But anyway, I decided to go. And my husband was kind of excited about going, I think. So this is my husband, Jerry. I want him to just stand up and show off his shirt, which is called a Vyzhyvanka, that shirt. That's their name for it, a Vyzhyvanka. And he got that in Ukraine. And his hair is a kind of a tribute to the Cossacks. And I'll talk about those a little bit. That is a Cossack hairdo. And my bracelet he bought from a veteran, I think, right, in Kyiv, which is the capital of Ukraine. Okay. Thank you. So I titled my talk, How Did We Get Here? Because I think most people wonder, how do wars get started? And so we'll talk about that and about the history, mainly the history of Ukraine and Russia together, what their history was. So just to show on the map, this is a map of Europe. And I've tried to use this cursor to show you this. Whoops. What happened? This purple right here, you see I'm moving it? That's Ukraine. Okay, so you see the border with Russia on the east, very big border with Russia. And then on the north with Belarus, and on the west with Poland, Slovenia, Hungary, Romania. I don't know, this map should have, oh, there it is, Moldova. Right there. And here's the Black Sea, which is figured pretty prominently in the news. And this right here, this little part that sticks down here, that's Crimea. That's the Crimean Peninsula. So just to give you an idea, Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe after Russia. It's 230,000 square miles. So it's just a little bit smaller than Texas, which is, I think, 261,000 square miles. This is a map of Ukraine, and you can see, oh, okay, on my screen, it's covered up, but you see down here, here's Crimea. And then, why is it doing this to me, Ron? This area over here, you see on the very eastern part, Luhansk and Donetsk. Those together are known as the Donbass, which you may have heard in the news. That's where the fighting was going on beginning in 2014. So the war that we have now is actually a continuation, much worse than the original war, which started in 2014. We'll talk a little bit about what happened there. So that's the Donbass, which gets its name from the coal basin there on the Donetsk River. The Donetsk River, so Don and then basin, Donbass. That's why it's called that in English, of course. And then moving up to more to the north, you see the Kiev Oblast. And an oblast is just an administrative district. So they have some governing that they do in each one of those oblasts. And each one of these that's on this map is an oblast. So there's the Kiev Oblast, and the city of Kiev is right in the center of it. And then if you go way over to the west, where Poland is, you see one called Lviv, which has been in the news as well. Jerry and I went to Lviv while we were there, and it's a very Western European feeling city, because this area actually over here used to be part of Poland. And I'll talk a little bit about how that changed. So this is the apartment building that I lived in Kiev. Modern, as you can see. It was, I have no idea if it's been damaged or anything in the war, this escalation of the war. I lived on the third floor, I guess. And it was very centrally located, so it was wonderful. I could walk to the Opera House. I could walk to a beautiful botanical garden. I could walk to the grocery store and a lot of different restaurants and stuff. So it was nice. And I got there in November of 2018. So it wasn't quite winter yet, but winter did come. This is a view from my window showing the kind of a little parking lot below the building. And believe it or not, when you look at the street that's, the part that's cleared, they do that with brooms. They did it by hand. I think the main streets, they must have machines, I never really saw any, but that's the way they did it. So it was kind of interesting time to be there. I was a little nervous about being there in the winter, but it was a mild winter, I'm told, and I survived it anyway. So I was there from November of 2018 to the beginning of May 2019. The week that I got there, maybe it was the week after I got there, Russia decided to seize 3 Ukrainian naval ships in the Black Sea, the Kerch Strait incident. Seized the ships and all the sailors on the ships. So martial law was declared the week after I got there, which was, I had to send out emails to all my friends and relatives saying, it's okay, where I am, you can't tell the difference, so. But it was a little disconcerting to be there when that happened. So what's in a name? Let's talk about this. When you were growing up, you probably always used the term the Ukraine, right? Is that pretty much what you remember? Everybody called it the Ukraine. And now it's just Ukraine. And in fact, if you call it the Ukraine, that's considered disrespectful by the Ukrainians. They think that makes it sound like they're not really a country. They're just sort of part of something else. But the reason it was called that is because Ukraine actually means borderland. And on the map, if you recall, it is right smack between east and west, between Russia and all these more Western countries. And so think of the Netherlands, for example. Netherlands means lowlands. And so we put a the in front of that, the Netherlands. And that's what we used to do with Ukraine, but they don't want us to do that anymore. So then the term Kyiv, which I have to confess, when I first went to Ukraine, I was still calling it Kiev. And when I went to the embassy for the first time for a briefing, they kept calling it Kyiv. And I'm thinking, what's wrong with them? Don't they know how to pronounce this? This is how ignorant I was, because it had changed to Kyiv. And the difference is Kiev is Russian and Kyiv is Ukrainian. So that's why if you hear the news now, and in fact, when the escalation of the war first started in 2022, there were a lot of newscasters that still use the term Kiev because, like me, they didn't really know that it wasn't to be called that anymore. Same thing with language. The official language for government, for documents, for speaking at meetings is now Ukrainian throughout the country. So in case you were wondering about that, that's kind of the difference. So here's the Ukrainian flag. This particular one happens to be hanging on my gate, a fence I have. This is my house in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where we first hung that flag, which amazingly we bought in, I think, Charleston, South Carolina, when we were visiting there. So, it's kind of everywhere. If you drive down Washington Avenue, there are a couple of houses there that are flying the Ukrainian flag. They're right next to each other. So the blue on the top stands for the sky, and then the yellow underneath is for the grain, in particular sunflowers, things like that. So this flag it has kind of an ancient history. They resurrected it at the time of their initial Declaration of Independence, which was like 1918, when the Soviet Union was having all of its problems. Not the Soviet Union, Russia. So it's when they became independent, they immediately went to this flag. The same thing with their symbol, which is the trident or the trizub. You can see this yellow right here. There's Jerry standing there next to a gate. And if you watch like Zelensky on TV, a lot of times you'll see his shirt. He'll have that trizub right here on his shirt. So that's their emblem. And again, it's a very ancient emblem. You can find coins from, the turn of like back to BC, I think, with that symbol on it. And so it was sort of the natural thing for Ukraine to adopt that once it became independent. So here's the beginning of a timeline of Ukrainian history. So I'm gonna go through this, and I'll try not to do it too slowly, bore you to death. But the very beginning, 482 was the founding of Kyiv, which when you compare that to Moscow, for example, Moscow 1147. So that's how much older Kyiv is than Moscow. You hear Putin all the time trying to make it sound like, Ukraine was part of Russia. They're sort of the stepchild. None of that is true. The Ukrainian region and the capital is much older than Russia. So the 9th century was the founding of what was called Kievan Rus, and Kyiv was the capital of that. Kievan Rus actually means land of the Swedes. There were a lot of Scandinavians that would come through the area that is now Ukraine from Scandinavia to go to Constantinople. Constantinople being very cosmopolitan center of trade at that time, very big city. And so they would come through what is now Ukraine. And so there was a lot of commerce with the people that lived there. And eventually there was this founding of what they called Kievan Rus, the land of the Swedes. They've done DNA tests on Ukrainians, and they don't have a lot of Scandinavian blood in them. So we think that probably what it was just more of a commerce thing. It wasn't like they settled there, did anything like that. And I just realized I forgot to show you something. Just a minute. This memorial, called the Founders Memorial, these are the people who are alleged to have founded Kyiv. 3 brothers in the back of the ship and their sister on the prow. They're very proud of that. So now get back to the timeline. Okay, so in the 10th century, there was a ruler of Kievan Rus named Volodymyr the Great. Now, Volodymyr is a name you're probably familiar with because that's President Zelensky's first name. And I've heard it pronounced Volodymyr and Volodymyr, and I'm really not sure. The latest pronunciation I heard was that it is Volodymyr. It's like in Russian, that would be Vladimir, VLAD. So it's sort of it's a common name in that area. So Volodymyr the Great was from the 10th century, and he accepted Christianity in 988. And he had like a baptism of 10,000 people at that time. So that's when they first became Christian, because your ruler says you're going to be Christian, you're going to be Christian. So that's what happened there. There's a church named after him. He did not found that church, but this is Saint Volodymyr's church, which was fairly close to where we lived. Very beautiful church. But the church that he did found was St. Sophia's. And this is the church you see all the time on the news with the newsmen standing in front of it. It's a miracle, really, that it survived the Soviet Union. They were getting ready to tear it down, like they did other churches in Kyiv. But it's on the UNESCO World Heritage Site. And there was such an international outrage about it that they didn't tear it down. This is an example of what it looks like inside. It's pretty incredible. It would have been horrible if it had been torn down. I mean, this is a 10th century church. I'll give you an example. Where do I have it? Just a minute. Sorry. Here we go. This is a church called St. Michael's, and this is a reproduction because the Soviets did tear this church down, and the Ukrainians decided to build it back up, which I think is pretty great that they did that. So that's kind of the history of Saint Volodymyr. Go back to my timeline. So the next ruler was Yaroslav the Wise. I love that name. The ruler before him was somebody the accursed, so I guess they were pretty glad they got Yaroslav the Wise. And he was very he had a lot of interaction with the Swedes and other Europeans. In fact, his wife was Swedish, and his 3 daughters became queens of Norway, Hungary, and France. So he had a lot of connections, and he was considered a very great ruler, and they call that the golden age of Kievan Rus. And then along came the horde, the Golden Horde, the Mongol invasion in 1237. 1240, they destroyed Kyiv completely. And they were ruling there until the Poland-Lithuania Commonwealth came along, 1349. And so that rule lasted almost 100 years. Actually, I'd take that back. It was longer than 100 years because it was actually in the northern and the western part of what is now Ukraine. The southern part became the Crimean Khanate in 1441. They broke away from the Golden Horde, the Mongols, and established their own rule. So what is now Ukraine was kind of split between sort of the western part and the southern part. people got kind of tired of that. And so when the Cossacks came along, the Cossacks being these guys who were very fierce fighters, and they said, we're going to save us from all of that. And so they took over. And that's Jerry's haircut. Here's a picture of a Cossack, a statue of this is in Lviv actually, but this was a Cossack. You know, you see his sword. He looks pretty fierce. So that lasted for, as you can see there, not all that long. In 1686, Poland and Russia decided we've had enough of these Cossacks. We're gonna split this. They were called hetmans. The leader was a hetman. We're gonna split this up, this hetmanate. So they did that in 1686, but then 1708, another Cossack came along whose name was Ivan Mazepa. And he said, you know, we're gonna try to do something about that. This is a bust of Ivan Mazepa. So he attempted to free the Eastern Hetmanate from Russian rule. But then in 1764, Russia said, we've had enough of that. And they abolished the Hetmanate. You know, they had more soldiers. They just had more military might than the Cossacks had. So that was about 17 years. And by 1781, then Russia fully annexed Eastern Ukraine. And then by 1795, most of Western Ukraine became part of the Russian Empire. So by 1795, that was pretty much, you know, Russia was ruling. And they got rid of the Crimean Khanate too. To continue on, then, of course, Russia, they say, okay, we're ruling now. We're going to do what we want. And they banned the use of the Ukrainian language. But, you know, what was happening in a lot of these countries at this time that were ruled by Russia, including Finland, which I don't know if you knew that, Finland only became independent in 1917. And there were other countries like that that were ruled by Russia. And so there was a nationalist fervor, you know, to try to regain their country. And there was a poet in Ukraine who's considered the father of Ukrainian literature, whose name was Taras Shevchenko. And he wrote this story, which it purports to be about a woman who was sort of a scarlet letter kind of thing. You know, she had a child out of wedlock. And anyway, but it's a metaphor. The whole thing is a metaphor. And I just wanted to read a little bit of what the description here says. Shevchenko was deeply troubled by the fate of his homeland and how Russian colonization was impoverishing Ukraine. As you can imagine, Ukraine was a stepchild. I mean, they weren't getting the best, you know. They would only what Russia would give them. His poetry foresees a free Ukraine, an heir to the free lands of the Cossack Hetmanate that were taken over by the Russian Empire a century beforehand. Shevchenko thus is regarded in Ukraine as not only a founder of modern Ukrainian literature and to a certain extent the modern Ukrainian language, but the first who wrote about the dream of a free Ukrainian nation. So he's on one of their bills of money. Their money, by the way, was declared by the Swiss bank to be the most beautiful currency in the world. It's all different colors, you know, and every denomination has a different Ukrainian person on it who's important to their history. So then Russia started having its problems, you know, with the Bolshevik Revolution and all that stuff. And other countries, you know, that were subject to Russia took advantage of that, like Finland, for example, that then did become independent in 1917 and never went back. And Ukraine tried that too. And they set up, 1917, they set up what's called the Central Rada, which is the name for their parliament. Verkhovna Rada. Rada means council. And they tried that for a while and declared independence and used that flag that I showed at the beginning. But, the Russians weren't having that. I guess they could let Finland go. Finland was far enough away, although they have a pretty big border with Russia, if you look at the map. But Ukraine, they weren't ready to let Ukraine go. So the Russian Red Army conquered 2/3 of Ukraine, and the western third became part of Poland at that time. And initially, the 1920s, they encouraged Ukrainian culture and language, but in the 30s, they reversed this policy. Stalin was very hard on Ukraine. You see, I have down there 1932 was the Holodomor. Holodomor means death by hunger. So that was a famine in the winter of 32-33 that came about because the Ukrainian farmers, remember, this is the breadbasket of Europe, there are a lot of Ukrainian farmers, and they were resisting collectivization. So Stalin said, okay, we'll show you. They took away all of their farming implements. They took away all of their seeds. They took away their food. They had nothing. So they starved to death. And the estimates of how many people died range up to 10 million people. And this is just something that, did you ever hear of this? This incredible genocide that Stalin committed. And, you don't hear about this. So, I mean, is it any wonder that there's not much love lost for the Russians, in Ukraine? Because this is what they did to them. And it especially, interestingly, hit hard in the eastern part of Ukraine, because there were a lot of farmers there. There is a memorial to the Holodomor, and you see this girl, emaciated girl, to represent, starvation. Jerry and I saw a movie right before we went to, what's the matter?
Bundle there on the table.
Oh, what? It's to symbolize that, yeah, the grain. A lot of people have these in their homes. I managed to find one at a gift shop and brought this one home with us. But we saw a movie about what it is like to starve to death, and it isn't pretty. It's a horrible death, because it's long, and yeah. So that's what they were subject to. Whoop, wrong one. There we go. During World War II, the Nazis invaded what is now Ukraine, and basically almost all of the Jews in Ukraine were killed. They weren't sent to gas chambers. They were basically lined up and shot. And there's a place in Kyiv called the Babin Yar, which was a mass grave. The people were just lined up in front of this and mowed down. Interestingly, the current president, Zelensky, is Jewish, and both of his parents are Jewish. And how his parents escaped that, or his grandparents, I guess, some of them were in Asia at the time of the Second World War. And then he had one grandfather who fought in the war for the Red Army, and three of the grandfather's brothers fought in the Red Army. They all died, but his grandfather survived somehow. So they managed to avoid the fate of a lot of European Jews somehow. But they made a deal. The Nazis made a deal with Russia to give the western part of what is now Ukraine, that was part of Poland then, to Russia. So that's when you have the current boundaries of Ukraine set, except for Crimea. Okay, Crimea still belonged to Russia. In Russia. In 1954, Khrushchev was president or premier, or whatever he was, of Russia. And he sort of inexplicably transferred Crimea to Ukraine. And you remember, Crimea was that little peninsula way down in the Black Sea that is kind of almost a separate thing. Why did he do that? People aren't really sure why he did it. One thing was he felt close to Ukraine because he was the premier. Each one of the separate socialist republics had their own leader that was then, of course, subject in Moscow, but he was the leader of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And he also grew up very close to the border of Russia and Ukraine. So they thought, well, he was trying to make Ukraine like Russia, and not, I don't mean alike, but to think fondly of them. And so he gave them Crimea. So 1986, Chernobyl. Everybody heard about Ukraine at that time, Chernobyl. Although, I don't know, people might have thought it was Russia where it happened, you know, but it was in Ukraine. And in fact, what happened after when the fallout was gonna come down, they decided they didn't want to make, the Russians did not want that to get over into Russia. So they seeded the clouds above Ukraine so that it would rain down on Ukraine instead of going into Russia. So another example of the treatment that Ukraine got from the Soviets. So then, of course, the Soviet Union finally did collapse and Ukraine declared its independence. And then we have this period I call political turmoil. I have this book called The Showman. This is Zelensky on the front. If you really want to read a good book, you want to read about Ukraine, this is a great book. The writer, it's Simon Schuster, who's a Time magazine correspondent. He's a very good writer. I really enjoyed reading it. But anyway, I just wanted to, it isn't just about Zelensky, it's about a lot about Ukraine. But I wanted to read this part where it describes the political turmoil. At the end of 2004, a popular uprising known as the Orange Revolution broke out in Ukraine. And the personalities involved were tailor-made for satire. For months, the revolution topped the news across Europe, in part because the characters were catnip to the media. There was the dunderheaded villain, Viktor Yanukovych, a patsy to the Kremlin, whose disputed victory in the presidential race set the rebellion in motion. There was the heroine, Yulia Tymoshenko, who commanded the protests on Independence Square with a golden braid wrapped around her head like a crown. And there was the telegenic leader of the revolution, Viktor Yushchenko, who fell victim to a poisoning plot involving former agents of the KGB that left his face grotesquely disfigured. The events were so operatic that it was hard to keep sight of what they represented for Ukraine, a popular rejection of Russian influence and a fundamental turn toward the West. So this is the kind of stuff that went on there. I mean, it was, you know, it was chaos. It was pretty much, yeah, it was pretty much chaos. And that went on for quite a long time. And one of the problems of what happened in the early days of Ukraine's independence was the rise of what are called the oligarchs. You've all heard that term. It's not a very old term, but it came about in Ukraine because these men got into power basically, and they managed to take hold of all of the critical infrastructure of Ukraine. What Ukraine did at first was they gave every person a voucher. So you can use this voucher at the auctions, you know, because remember, everything was owned by the government before independence. So they gave them these vouchers, and the vouchers they could use to try to bid on, you know, a portion of these industries, yeah, and resources. So what happened? There was a black market for the vouchers, right? It wasn't legal to sell your voucher, but nobody paid any attention to that, including the law enforcement, the prosecutors. Nobody paid attention. So certain men who had money already, some money, you know, bought these things up, and they were able to get control of, well, most everything. TV stations, iron, steel, railroads, you know, everything. So unfortunately, that was very unfortunate because what happened in Ukraine did not happen in the other Soviet socialist republics. They They were able to avoid that, but I just want to give you an example of the amount of money we're talking about. If we look at the real value of the assets of the holding company, Uradprom, which was it made steel for cars, trains, construction, all that kind of stuff. It amounted to about $20 billion, and this entire holding was purchased for as little as 400 million. Worth 20 billion, and they got it for 400 million. Because, you know, they agreed on what they were going to buy, all these oligarchs. So another case was a steel mill that was the largest in Ukraine. It accounted for 20% of Ukraine's steel output, turned a $377 million profit, yet it was sold for 850 million that year, only to be renationalized and auctioned off again a year later after this Orange Revolution for $4.8 billion. So the government allowed this to happen. These oligarchs were in parliament. They got parliament to pass laws that were favorable to them. And so there was just a lot of corruption. Everybody's heard about that, right? There's a lot of corruption in Ukraine, and there was, and there still is, unfortunately. So the people, you know, at some point woke up to this. 2013, what happened there was that the president at that time was a man named Viktor Yanukovych. And he had agreed that they would sign an association agreement with the EU so that at some point down the road, when Ukraine got its act together, they could join the EU. The last minute, he reneged on that and he wouldn't sign it. And so there were a lot of people that weren't very happy with that. And so they started protesting. Let me show you the square. They started as, you know, maybe a couple hundred, and then it got bigger and it got bigger and it got bigger, and there was crackdown, you know, the police were cracking down, and finally they started shooting. This is a picture of the square called the Maidan, which stands for Independence Square. It's a very large square, as many European cities have, very large squares. There were hundreds of thousands of people packed into this square at some point when the shooting started. And that was at the orders of Yanukovych, and over 100 people were killed. Up to this point, Yanukovych had thought, well, maybe I can deal with these protesters. Maybe I can negotiate with them and make a deal. But once he killed all these people, there was no making a deal. And he realized that. And so he took off and fled to Russia and took a lot of loot with him. This is a painting of him. And then this is the house that he built to live in. It was supposed to be, you know, a hunting lodge. It's just a hunting lodge. And there was a secret tunnel to get in there so people could go in and pay their bribes to him and not be seen. And they had a workout room in there. We toured this house. They had a workout room that was, you know, people could use as their excuse. That's why I was there. I went there to work out, right? That workout equipment had never been used. You know, we could see that. So here's just an example of the interior. Here's a stairway. Looks pretty nice. The woodwork alone costs like, I don't know, they had these German craftsmen came in and it was like over $10 million just for the woodwork. You know, these beautiful inlaid floors. And this is a silver-plated Jaguar. He left that behind. So chances are, you know, the stuff he took was more valuable than that. Yeah, pretty amazing. So that's the Maidan revolution started, and Yanukovych fled, and Russia was upset. And so what did they do? They seized Crimea. He said, okay, we're going to show you. So that was when basically the war in the eastern part of Ukraine started, in the Donbass that I talked about. So wanted to see. For the leadership, again from the showman, for the leadership in Kyiv, the courage of civilians in this battle and many others across Ukraine revealed one of the fundamental flaws in the Russian war plan. Putin counted on at least part of Ukrainian society to welcome his troops as liberators or stand aside and allow the occupation to proceed. This is later, but just to give you a flavor for, this is what they thought. A Russian general admitted there was the expectation that we would be greeted with flowers. Instead, vast numbers of regular Ukrainians joined the resistance in whatever ways they could, often at great personal risk, and with little, if any, training in Kyiv and many other cities. Long lines formed outside of draft offices, and this is when the big war started. Grandmothers were making Molotov cocktails. I love this. We got these books in Ukraine. Here's a picture of a Cossack holding a Molotov cocktail, it's sort of a classic of Ukraine. So that's what happened in 2014. The Kerch Strait seizure, I've already talked about. That happened right after I got to Ukraine. They seized these naval ships and held on. They finally did give those soldiers back. They made a trade, of course. Then in 2019, while we were there, Volodymyr Zelensky was elected. This was a pretty amazing thing. The way they do elections there, the whole campaign lasts maybe 3 months. And so anybody who qualifies to be on the ballot can run. And I've forgotten now what it takes to qualify. But there was something like 32 candidates on the first ballot. So the top 2 vote getters, if nobody gets more than 50%, the top 2 vote getters have a runoff. So the top 2 vote getters were Zelensky and Petro Poroshenko, who was the current president. And, people had had enough of him. He hadn't done anything to stop the war in the East, and that was a big part of Zelensky's platform. I'm going to stop that war in the East, and things are going to be better. He won something. He definitely won over a majority of the vote, and the parliament elections were separate. Those were supposed to be in the fall, in November of 2019, but he said, I'm not waiting for that. I dissolve parliament right now, and we're going to have elections next month. And his party, the Servant of the People Party, got over 70% of the seats in parliament. So you've probably heard about Zelensky and what his background was, maybe. I mean, when I first came back from Ukraine, I thought about doing a presentation like this, and I thought I was going to have to go into great detail about Volodymyr Zelensky, but I think pretty much everybody's heard about him now. Yes, he was a comedian. He made a lot of money with movies and his TV shows, and a lot of his TV shows were sort of Saturday Night Live, kind of. I mean, they made fun of politicians. He didn't discriminate. Politicians on both sides. He made fun of everybody, and so everybody knew him. I mean, he was very famous in Ukraine, but he had a history. When he first started in show business, it was part of this competition. I think it was called KVN, which was in Russia and Ukraine, and comedians would do their acts and then they'd win or lose or get voted on, whatever. Well, he realized as part of that he was never going to come out on top because he wasn't Russian. Only the Russians would be the ones who would win that. So he finally said, I've had enough of this. He went back to Ukraine and he just devoted his career to the Ukrainian people. But all of his programs and movies were in Russian. He grew up speaking Russian. He lived in an area that was eastern part of Ukraine, and that's what they spoke was Russian. Eventually, he has switched. Now he's president of the country. He does speak Ukrainian now, but he struggled with that for a while. But anyway, so he gets elected, and people are, I was there when they were discussing, who are we going to vote for, and it was the older people that were reluctant to vote for him because, well, he was a comedian, what is he going to run this country? What's he going to do? And he didn't really have a platform. He didn't talk about that. So he got elected, and, he's made a lot of mistakes, put it that way. One of his biggest mistakes, I think, was thinking he could rely on the humanity of Vladimir Putin and try to negotiate an end to the war in the East. And, that's just not going to happen. He finally realized it was like being in a big bowl of Jello. You're just sinking and you can't get out, and you're just going around in circles. So finally, he realized that Putin was trying to brainwash his people, and he did this through the television. So they had the three TV stations that were owned by some of this one oligarch. And so Zelensky basically banned the 3 TV stations. And that was, that set off some alarm bells. I mean, that couldn't be done in this country, for example. But he did it, and he did it because he felt that he had to do that because they were trying to brainwash his people. And he felt that already the people in the eastern part of Ukraine were brainwashed. Because, what were they seeing on TV? They were seeing everything that was favorable to Russia. So he did this, and this guy named Viktor Medvedchuk was one of Putin's best friends. Putin was godfather for Medvedchuk's daughter, so that's how close they were. And then Zelensky, he seized Medvedchuk's lucrative pipeline, banned his 3 TV stations. So Putin responds that's when he started to amass troops on the border, the northern border, through like Belarus. They let him, they're a Putin lackey too. So they let him do what he wanted. But that's kind of when it started in 2021, when Zelensky started taking some pretty bold action. Then in April of that year, Medvedchuk was arrested and charged with treason. And in May, Putin published an essay suggesting Ukraine's not really a country. They're just a tool of the West. So it was pretty clear that he wasn't about to give Ukraine up without a fight. He tried very hard to do it without a fight. He tried to do it through their parliament, get his people into the parliament. But it didn't work. Zelensky was kind of one step ahead of him. And so now we know what happened. 2022, February, Russia invaded Ukraine. So on a lighter note, I thought maybe I'd just show you some pictures of some things in Ukraine. Well, first of all, this appeared when we were there, somebody likening Putin to Hitler. I thought that was a really funny poster. This is a monastery called the Lavra, and it's Russian Orthodox. So that's something else that happened while we were there, was that the president at that time of Ukraine went to the I guess it's called Metropolitanate in Istanbul, who was sort of the leader, like the Pope for the Roman Catholics, is sort of the leader of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and said, we want to be separate from the Russian Orthodox Church. We want to be the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And he said, okay. And Russia wasn't happy about that either. So this monastery is still part of the Russian Orthodox Church. But a lot of the monks that are there have been suspected of spying, and so there've been search warrants and arrests and stuff like that. of the people in this monastery. But it's a really amazing place. I mean, they have several different museums there. One of the museums has gold from back in the BC times. I mean, Scythian gold, very old, incredibly old jewelry, things like that. And then there's the Museum of Miniatures, which was just something that I just couldn't get over it. There's one man that makes these things, and they are so tiny, you have to look at them with a microscope. So you're seeing a flea with shoes on, a camel going through the eye of a needle or next to an eye of a needle, stuff like that. And just incredibly small. I mean, I don't know how the man does it, but you know, so it's kind of it was a fun place to visit. There are also, they call it the cave monastery because there are caves there that are kind of like the catacombs in Rome. I think people are buried there and stuff, but we didn't go down there because my colleague that I worked with, the American that I worked with, told me it was pretty musty, and I can't tolerate that, so we didn't go there. But this is an area of Kyiv that I really liked, and I love this sign. I love Podil. That I have read that Podil has been bombed, so I don't know exactly what it looks like now. But there was a Ferris wheel there, and there was an ice skating rink for the little kids, and it was just kind of a fun place to go. This is a railway station in Lviv, which is way over on the west. When we went to Lviv, we flew there, and then we took the train back so that we could see the countryside. But it just shows you how beautiful. European railway stations are pretty amazing. And then this is the metro escalator in Kyiv. You had to go down 2 of these to get to the bottom. That's how deep it was. So when you read about the people sheltering in these metro stations, I mean, they're way underground. Yeah, it was pretty amazing. You had to plan ahead. You had to take plan extra time to go down just to get down this escalator. But of course, the trains, as is so true in Europe, they really ran on time. You didn't have to wait long to get your train. This is called the House of Chimera. I just thought it was just so fun to see stuff like this. These are like little gnomes and dwarfs and stuff. And then this, if you look here at these, what's holding up these balconies, angels holding up the balconies. You can see by the shape of the building, it's kind of, there are a lot of cracks, and it's not in the greatest of shape, but they have this wonderful architecture there, everywhere. It was really fascinating. And of course, they have street art like we're getting in Alpena. They had a lot of this. This was one of my favorites. This I guess an elk. I think it looks like, maybe it's a caribou. Anyway. But you see how big it is. You see Jerry down there? Right there? That's Jerry. So that's how big it was. This was another street sculpture. It was one of my favorites. Flower markets. They were wonderful. And this looks like it's underground because it is underground. There was a place, more than one place, but one that was fairly close to where we lived, where 5 streets came in together, and they were big streets. I mean, they were like maybe 3 lanes across each street. And so think about trying to get to the other side of where you wanted to be, trying to cross the street just wasn't going to work. So they built these tunnels underneath, and then there was a lot of room down there. So there were a lot of shops, and there was this flower market. The Bessarabsky market, this is above ground. And this place was amazing. This picture, I just loved it. It was one of my favorite pictures from all of our time in Ukraine. You see all the dried fruit and the nuts and everything, and it's so colorful and just so, artistically done. It's just beautiful. But they had a lot of things at that market. You could buy meat and all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
The picture before, you showed flowers.
Yeah.
Where would all of that come from?
Well, I don't, my guess, I'm not really sure, but I spent some time in Colombia, and Colombia grows something like 80%, I think, of the world's flowers because it's so close to the equator. It has the same kind of sunlight all the time. And when you fly into Bogota, you see all these greenhouses, covered greenhouses and stuff. So I don't know if that's where they come from or not, but Or maybe they grow their own because they do have a lot of farmland. I would think they devote most of that to food, but
What time of the year would you stay?
well, I was there from November to May to April, late April. So this is in the winter. Yeah, so they weren't growing these in Ukraine, I guess. Yeah, you're right. They're probably growing them in Colombia is my guess, but I don't know for sure. Yeah. A long way to transport them. Yeah. This is a street market that was the street right across from where we lived. Every Saturday, they had this market. I mean, you see how, can you see the people in the back? She's got a winter coat on. I mean, this was every Saturday. It didn't matter what time of year it was. These are hardy people. They are really hardy. You know, and they're so devoted to their country. It was no big shock to me that they were able to do what they've done. Especially, you know, what I've tried to lay out for you is the history, their history with Russia. There's no love lost there for most of the people. You know, in the East, you know, it's a little different there. Like I say, I think they've recognized Russia's kind of brainwashed those people. But so this market was every Saturday. You can see there are chickens there. There's, I don't know, there's all kinds of vegetables and garlic and yeah. This is used to be called the National Museum of Russian Art, but the name has been changed to just the National Museum of Art. And it was so beautiful inside there. I mean, just the, you know, the woodwork and the design of the door. This just a doorway, you know, it was really, really something. This is inside the Opera House. You know, gives you an idea of the plaster work, you know, that was done there. It was really, really beautiful. And the operas and the ballets, I went to several ballets there. You could go to a ballet for like $25 and you're seeing, you know, you're seeing what's equivalent to the Russian ballet. I mean, they're really good dancers. It was really phenomenal. The opera, I think maybe cost $30 that I went to. It was, you know, but people in Ukraine by and large can't afford that, even that. But for us, you know, it was pretty amazing. So I just kind of want to close it out before, you know, questions with a couple more things from this book, which again, is really a great book. Throughout its history as an independent state, political power had swung from one side of the national divide to the other, from east to west, through war and revolution, and now the voters in almost every region had rallied around a single candidate. This is when Zelensky was elected. In the process, they exposed the hollowness of Putin's lies about Ukraine, his claims that the country had been a historical mistake, stitched together from incongruous parts, incapable of unity, and led by neo-fascists, with millions of citizens and vast territories that belong by right with Russia. It took the victory of a Russian-speaking Jew from Kryvyi Rih, a little town in the east, to show that Putin's theories about Ukraine were not only false, but ridiculous. In the eastern regions that Putin liked to describe as parts of the Russian world, Zelensky got nearly 90% of the vote. But things, unfortunately, have kind of changed a little bit. They didn't like some of the things that Zelensky did. And he wasn't, like I said, he's definitely not immune from criticism. He's, you know, he didn't have a lot of background in being a president except on TV. He was the president on TV. That was his program, The Servant of the People. He played the president. And so that's what he named his political party, was Servant of the People. And he, you know, in terms of the war, he let his generals do their thing because he knew he didn't know anything about how to run a war. He made a mistake of not taking Putin seriously enough, despite the United States warning him, you know, they're going to invade you. But after they did, he let his generals do that. And he did what he is best at. And that's being sort of like Reagan in a way, the great communicator. Well, that was Zelensky. You know, went on TV every single day. He goes on TV to talk to his people. He travels around the world. If he can't go to particular places, he appeals to them through Zoom. You know, he's talked to our Congress, he's talked to the EU, all of these leaders of these other countries, he has, you know, done his best to do what he can for his country. So this is just sort of a description of Zelensky's thinking. He had seen pictures of the funeral of Joseph Stalin. So here you have this man who, you know, he was horrible to the Russians. You know, as bad as he was to Ukraine, he was bad to Russians too. I mean, we all know that. You know, he was an incredibly ruthless dictator. But yet, during his funeral, people were trampling each other to get close to the casket, mourning, you know, his loss. And he saw these pictures. This is what drew Zelensky back to those images. The waxen face and withered arm of the Generalissimo in his casket, the throngs wailing for him at the Kremlin walls, was the spell the Soviet Union had cast over its people, the way its propaganda had convinced them that the devil was a saint. In the present war, Ukraine was fighting a similar set of delusions, and Zelensky understood the Russians would be hard to defeat, not only because of their arsenal, but because of the force of Putin's lies. This is a quote from him. "It shocks me to see the power of this information, the sickness of it. The scariest thing is that his people can't see through it. Based on the reactions we have seen, they wish us death. They want our children to die," unquote. By this point in the war, polls had consistently shown that a majority of Russians supported it. And Zelensky saw it as his mission to break that spell, to subvert the narratives people consumed through Russian television. It helped explain why he had been so fixated on shutting down Russia's propaganda channels in Ukraine before the invasion started, and why Putin had reacted with such fury. And then finally, this is the very end of the book. Years from now, when Ukraine looks back on the horrors of this war, its toll may come into focus, assuming the state will one day agree to release its casualty figures to the public. 18 months, that's when this was written. We're now a year past that. But 18 months into the full-scale invasion, the estimated loss of life stood in the hundreds of thousands. Among them, the legions of men and women, doctors and DJs, school teachers and shopkeepers, people from every corner of society who volunteered to help in the defense of the country they love. Let's hope. Let's hope they can bring an end to that war. But the thing that kind of that makes me sad is that I don't think Putin will ever give up. As long as there's a Putin, you know, even if they win this war, you know. But finally, I did a blog while I was in Ukraine. So if you're at all interested in reading it, this is the URL, charterukraine.blogspot.com. And I did one every single week I was there. And what I tried to do was I limited it to basically right around 14 lines. That's all. And then pictures, you know, and I would have a theme kind of every week. And so that's it. Questions? Yeah.
The food, what was your?
Borscht. It's wonderful.
Anything else?
Wonderful. Every grandmother has their own recipe for borscht. They're all different and they were all wonderful. No, I haven't tried to make it, but you know, they would always serve it with these little like Parker House dinner rolls. It was the funniest thing. I don't know what that was about, but that's kind of, you know, every restaurant, every Ukrainian restaurant, there's borscht on the menu.
Need to repeat the question.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. Well, I didn't let him finish. What is your question? I have a bad habit. Yeah.
You Ukrainian food.
Yeah.
What's the mainstay?
What's the mainstay of Ukrainian food? Well, as I said, borscht is a mainstay. Of course, potatoes, onions, that kind of stuff. There's something called sala, isn't that what it was called? Which is fried fat. And they love that stuff. We tried it. Yeah. Didn't do much for me, but Jerry liked it. Black bread, yeah, yeah. The grocery stores are very interesting there. Everything is bulk, even frozen food. You know, there's a big bin of peas and carrots, you know, frozen peas and carrots. They have the big fish tanks with live stuff in there, you know, and all the bread. You have to, they have these women who are in charge of every little department, and you have to get everything weighed and priced before you go to the cashier. Which of course I didn't know the first time I went. And I get to the cashier and she's saying something to me. I have no idea. And it seemed like every time I got in that situation, there would be somebody behind me who spoke English. Thank goodness. And they told me, no, you got to go get it weighed. Okay.
They were added to the grocery staff.
Yeah.
Just to accommodate.
They had a lot of employees. They full employment, you know, in the grocery store. Yeah. Yeah, holdover from Soviet days. Yeah. Got a job. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Is there a different class level of people economically?
Is there a different level of class of people economically? Oh, for sure. There are the oligarchs. I mean, in Kiev, like walking distance from where we lived was a Bentley dealership. Right downtown, a Bentley dealership. I saw a woman in a grocery store one day. I couldn't get over it. She had on a fur coat, and this man who was dressed in like a bellhop suit, you know, he was carrying her groceries out for her. She's seriously, she's walking out just like this. It was unbelievable. I was just like, wow. So you have the average people, which is most of the people who don't make much money at all, and then you have the very, very wealthy people.
Do they have food programs to help the people that are at the lower level?
Do they have food programs to help people at a lower level? I don't know that they do. They do have free health care. Although if you want better than what they provide for free, you know, you can pay for it. So, I mean, they don't let people starve. So I think they must have programs. Yeah.
Jan, you were there before the invasion of the Russians.
The latest
Yeah,
invasion.
before,
Yes.
after Crimea, but before.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
From this distance, do you have any sense of the war weariness going on?
Well, I think, you know, in our country, and do I have any sense for, I guess you're,
Yeah, I
hear
plugged
you.
in, yeah.
War weariness. I think people in this country are getting weary of it. I think people in Europe are probably getting weary of it. But, you know, it's like Zelensky has tried to explain to people, if Putin wins this war, he won't stop. You know, and I think you've seen that with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, right? I mean, they tried to maintain neutrality for the longest time. Jerry and I have been to Finland also. And we were told before we were going on our way up to the Lapland, to the Arctic Circle, and we were told, you know, you might be in the middle of nowhere and you're going to come across an 8-lane highway in the middle of nowhere. And we did. And that's so that they can land jets. The Finns can use that if they need to, because this was pretty close to the border with Russia. So they worry about that all the time. So I think in that part, you know, the former Soviet Union, I think, or Finland wasn't part of the Soviet Union, but they were ruled by Russia for a long time. And I think all of those countries are very fearful about that.
My son is in the Air Force and he's stationed in Germany, and they frequently do exercises in Hungary.
Okay. She said that her son is in the Air Force in Germany, with the United States, I assume, right? Yeah, but stationed in Germany, and they frequently do exercises in Hungary. Oh yeah, I think there are probably exercises in a lot of places. You know, as far as the Ukrainians go, yeah, they're tired of this war, but that isn't going to stop them from fighting it. I mean, they're very devoted to their country and to democracy. They know what it's like to live under Russia's thumb. Ron.
Speak at all to the corruption behavior of parts of our society.
It's rampant in Ukraine.
Yeah, can I speak to the corruption there, that we hear a lot about corruption, that it's rampant there. It's not as bad as it used to be. I've talked about, what happened when Ukraine initially became independent. And there's still some of that going on where, people try to get into parliament and make laws that are beneficial to their businesses. I should have mentioned this. I didn't really talk about my colleague over there, who was this 30-year-old dynamo named Megan, who, when I first went there, I thought, oh my gosh, what was I? 70 at the time, 65, and she's 30. And I thought, how is she going to get along with this old lady, And we just got along great. I mean, it was wonderful. It was one of the best experiences of my life. We had, we really meshed in terms of our strengths and our weaknesses, and whatever. It was great. But anyway, Megan is now working for the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, and she volunteered to go back to Ukraine. She's going in January. So, even those of us who, went there, I mean, we have a very strong love for Ukraine, and want to do what we can to help them, But yeah, the corruption is still, there are still issues, and she would be part of probably trying to help them work through that. So, I mean, Zelensky didn't need to take any bribes. He's got plenty of money. He earned his money. He's not an oligarch. He earned his money through his movies and his television shows and stuff. But anybody else?
Else?
Okay, well, thank you all for coming.